Hello, this is Richard White again from East Jersey Trout Unlimited. Again, I'm one of the members who also teaches the fly tying class. My last fly I put up was a jeweled caddis, and it used glass beads for the abdomen of the caddis. And you'll see, once again, I'm going to be using glass beads, but this time on a beaded bucktail tandem fly. And you notice the colors are very much the colors of a standard 9-3, the black and the green. Pretty straightforward to tie. Now, for the glass beads, the trick is to, well, for me, it was picking glass beads over the usual plastic beads. The plastic beads that normally get used on tandem flies are large, either orange or red, very much for attractors. I kind of wanted to go with something closer to the colors of the fly itself without the glaring attractors. The glass beads are also somewhat smaller, so you don't get that big chunky middle on them. I haven't found that those are as effective as these are. So besides, I think these look prettier. But anyway, so to tie this, it's pretty straightforward. I'll be working with, for thread, it's just a uni thread in what is this, a 6/0. The wire, rather than using the standard trolling wire, I'm using Surflon 1x7, and this happens to be 40 pound, which I find is just about the right stiffness. Notice the it still has lots of wiggle, but it will stay straight. It doesn't tend to bend like the way some other types do. For hooks, I like a wider gape hook, so these are Mustad C61SAPs, a number 2 for the front, and then a number 4 for the rear hook. The body on the rear, I'm using a green mylar. For the front hook, I'm using a dubbing from Fly Tyers Dungeon. It's a very long fibered dubbing, so it's really easy to build bodies from it. You can even use them for wings. So BGD, this one I'm in a hot white, really bright. Even though you won't see it from here, you would certainly see it. Fish would certainly see it from underneath. The glass beads are between 3 and 4 millimeters in diameter, using both reds and greens. White bucktail, green bucktail, black bucktail, and then for the cheeks, what I have are feathers from pheasant rump that have been dyed yellow. So these are just church window feathers from a pheasant rump dyed yellow. Everything here is actually pretty easy to get. So let's start with the rear of the hook. I'll start by taking out the model fly, putting in a hook, and then we start by binding in the excuse me one second here. Start by binding in the wire, and of course, as I'm sitting here, my bobbin has come unthreaded. So, as with anything, start by building up a thread base. That'll give a nice base for the wire to attach to. Excuse me while I pick up the wire off the floor. Now, for this, I use basically about 2.5 inches of wire, which gives me just the right length for the length of the body I want. You can certainly use make your fly longer if you like, but I would do that by using a longer shank hook rather than a longer section of wire. Otherwise, I find it's just easier for the wire to get torqued around. Okay, since this is the rear hook, notice this wire is very straight, which is great. Just going to lay it right on top because this It's a straight-eyed hook, and gonna bind it down, and I'm gonna go up and down several times to make sure it's good and tight. Now, I have never had these pull out, even though I'm not using a super heavy thread to bind it down, because I'm also, after I go down and back once, I'm also going to add, whoops, and there I broke my thread, which we all do. Catching it on the end of the wire will do that to you. Come on. So back, bind that down. Trim that, and all that's going to get covered. So now I will use just a little bit of Zap-A-Gap. Use a needle to spread that, and that will bind that wire down quite permanently. All right, once we've done that, I'm going to bring this back forward so that I can tie in my tinsel. Again, since it's a two-sided tinsel, and I want the green to show, I will tie the green in facing the hook shank on my side. And that way when I wind it around, our green will be the only color showing. So all the way down, all the way back. And obviously the glue will also help hold that in place. Wind the body. Now, I have experimented with flipping this and having this part be red rather than green. It doesn't seem to make any difference. I was hoping it might serve as a bit of an attractant. Didn't seem to make any difference, so I prefer the look of the green, so I go with that since it doesn't seem to matter to the fish. All right, now, obviously finish with the rear hook. So I'm just going to whip finish. So around, and since the wire is not extremely long, let me nudge this over a little bit for you. Since the wire is not extremely long, the whip finisher will pass right over it. And we're finished there. Touch of head cement, which is all it should take. And then we'll remove that and set it aside for a moment. And move on to the front hook, the larger hook. Excuse me 1 second. All right, so same as before, lay down a thread base. Now it's a fairly long shank hook, so we have plenty of purchase for the wire. And I'll go down, and I'll go back, and I leave it a little bit rough on purpose. I think it gets a little bit better grip into the plastic coating on the wire when you can really mash it down into the existing layers. So now I like to turn the hook so I'm looking straight down on the shaft here, So I find that makes it a little easier to lay the wire directly on top. Start it down. This way I can make sure it's staying aligned, holding it in place with my fingers, and now binding it down as tightly as I dare with the thread I have. Now, you could go with a heavier thread. This is 136 denier. You could go with 210 if you wanted, or even GSP. I just haven't found it's necessary. Now, of course, you'll pick up the mistake I've made already, which is I started tying this in before I threaded on my beads. So notice the pattern of the beads is red bead at each end with green beads in the middle, and this is just very simply thread the beads onto the wire. So this is easier for me to do off camera, but one red bead, and I find what I like is with this size bead is 7 of the green beads. If you used a slightly bigger bead, you'd use fewer. Obviously, if you use a smaller bead, you would need more. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and these beads are plenty big enough to use in hand. You don't need the bead tweezers that might be useful on a smaller bead. And then another red, and the reds are just there as kind of hot spots for the fish. So now back to exactly where I was before, laying the wire on top, and notice when I've done this, that number of beads just fills the space between the hooks, which is always the goal. And then I can start binding the wire down to the hook, always trying to make sure the wire is exactly on top of the hook shank. So I start a little bit looser turns just to make sure I've got it aligned correctly, then I can really clamp down. And once I'm sure of that, I can turn the hook back so I'm looking at it from the side. So I'll go all the way down, all the way back, getting as tight as I dare. Bring it down again. Actually, I'm going to stop there, put on a drop or two of the Zap-A-Gap again, this time turning it more slowly so I don't get any drippage. Use a needle to spread. Therefore, I get the maximum contact. Things glue in as well as possible. Then I can bring the thread, again wrapping tightly, back to the rear of this hook shank. Notice everything now sits in place quite straight. I've got everything lined up. Now I just need my dubbing. I like this particular dubbing because it's UV reflective and it is very long, staple, long fibered. Therefore, it's very easy material to dub in. I even use this on wings on some flies. So take out a nice stretch, wind it on, bring it up close till I get it started. Then I can just spin and dub. And I'm going to need a little bit more. But again, as I'm saying, with this long fibered dubbing, it's very easy to spin on and then to wrap. And then you can nicely pick some of this out to give you some fibers that will run further back into the wing. Okay, so now at this point I can pick a little bit of this out just to give it a slightly fuller body profile. Add a little bit more flash to that part of the body. All right, so now it's all about wing. Actually, I tend to start with the belly, and as I do with any part of the fly, I like to turn the fly so that I'm looking directly at the area where I'm going to tie something. So I'm turning this so that I'm looking directly at the bottom of the hook. And so now I can lay in my bucktail, the white bucktail for the belly. And these are fairly long flies, so you want to make sure you have some fairly long bucktail. Excuse me while I'm going to pick out the short fibers. Do some of that over the trash to make less of a mess in my tying space. I don't tend to stack because I think you get a nicer taper if you don't stack. Then I'm just going to lay this along the shank so that it only comes to about the back of the fly. I tend to keep the belly a little shorter just so it doesn't get wrapped. So once I get to the length I want, I will then cut to length. I find it's easier than trying to do it after I put it on. Lay this onto the belly, slightly to my side. Try to get my fingers out of the way so you can see. A couple of loose turns until I'm sure I have it where I want it. Then I can start to bind it down. And as I'm doing that, I make sure that it's running perfectly straight down the hook shank. And once I'm happy with that, I can keep binding. Not worried about looking perfect yet because I'll finish that up at the end, but I'm also here defining kind of how far back the head will go. Okay, once that's in place, I can then straighten all that out on both sides of the front hook. I have a good sense of where it's going to lie. You notice this is a pretty fine bucktail. And that's going to make the belly of the fly. So now, again, if this is a 9-3, for the wing of the fly, it's going to be green and then black over the green. So, again, from my green bucktail, cut some nice long hairs. And I want this fairly full. Part of what you want to do is make sure that the wing is fuller than the belly, otherwise the fly might have a tendency to invert on you. So you want to make sure the wing is just a little bit fuller than the belly. So I'll have the green all by itself be about the same amount of hair as on the belly, and then the black above that will flesh it out more. So again, I'm going to take the green hair as before, pull out all the short hairs, Some of these are much longer, so I will then blend them back in. Pull out anything excess. Now I like the wing a little bit longer, so it extends a bit beyond the tail. I'm going to go in this case, so half inch, 3/4 of an inch beyond the very back of the fly. Use my hand to measure. Over to the trash can. Cut off the excess. Once again, I'm going to turn the fly, so I'm looking, in this case, directly at the back, so I can see directly down onto where I'm tying this bucktail. So I'm going to lay the bucktail in place, slightly to my side so the thread can take it around. A couple of loose turns, and I'm going to turn to make sure it's wrapping slightly around the sides. So I want it to go slightly around each side, so it's not just on top. Once I've established that, then I can start binding this down much more tightly. And more turns. Make sure I like how that's sitting. Bring this tiny bit back towards me. And a few looser turns towards the back of the head so that the bucktail sits a little bit flatter, so I get a more streamlined fly. After all, when I'm using these up in Maine, it's imitating a smelt, so I want a fairly slender profile. On top of that, since this is a 9.3, a very standard fly, I want black bucktail, and this can be, the amount of black I use is usually a little bit less than what I used on the green. Excuse me while I cut this off screen. So, as before, pull out any shorter fibers. Make sure I like the shape, and that looks pretty good. And I'm going to want this to be, it's a little more than I want, so let me pull a few of those out. I'd like this to be about the same length as the previous layer. So lay that on top, use my thumb to mark it, cut the length, trying to do as much of my cutting as possible over my trash can so I don't have to do quite as much cleanup afterward. Again, turning the shank so I'm looking straight down on the shank. A few loose turns to make sure I like the placement. I'm going to go a little further around the side. Then, as I come forward, I can really tighten up on that. Whoops, and I lost some of those hairs, so I'm going to go back and put some of those back in place. Because I think it's a little sparse without those. They all seem to come off one side, so we'll go back and put them on the same side they came off of. All right, so bind down, build up the head. A few fibers here, excuse me, I'm going to snip off a few dubbing fibers that came forward. So now you can certainly fish it like this. I have had good success fishing these without the cheeks. I just really like the looks of the cheeks on them. So again, I'm going to bring in some of this for each side, one feather from the rump of a pheasant, but it's been dyed yellow. And I normally start on the far side first, because that's the harder side to see, so I want that one in place. Then strip off the fluff at the base. Make it as even as possible. Then I will, again, turn the side of the fly to myself so I can see exactly how I'm laying it in. It makes it harder for you to see, I understand. I'm going to do a couple of turns and turn it back so you can see how it's going to sit. And then once I'm happy with that, I can start binding that down. And then I'm going to clip off the excess of that shank. Let me do a few turns to clean that up. And then one feather for the other, for my side. I'm going to do exactly what I did before. First, make sure it's the same length as the other. Zip off all that extra fuzz. Lay the feather in place. This time it's on my side, a little hard for you to see, but and I just keep my thumb pinning the feather so that it stays flat while I wrap. And the other one slipped right out on me, so I'm going to have to lay that one right back in. But that's not a big deal. I need to just bind down a little harder than I did before. Now I'm going to keep a little tension on there since that was an issue a moment ago. Clip off the excess. Smooth up that head a little bit. Then whip finish. Let me bring that back around for you to get a better view. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all moving forward. Finish that off. Clip off the excess thread. And other than a little head cement, we're finished. And obviously I'll come back later, put another layer of head cement on after this one dries. For head cement, using what a lot of people use, which is the Sally Hansen Hard as Nails. Find it works wonderfully well. It's not terribly expensive, works well. What else can you ask for? And when we're done, we have a very effective trolling fly. Now, I used these on my trip up to Maine earlier this year, early in May. Some nice landlocked salmon and some very nice sized lake trout, both on these because I was there for ice out, and so everybody, all the fish were up close to the surface, which is really makes it much easier to catch some of those fish when you don't have to worry about getting down to the depths. So this is a beaded, once again, a beaded tandem bucktail 9-3. You know, a very standard fly in terms of colors. Classic in Maine. The biggest difference being the use of colored beads. Gives a lot of brightness to the fly, keeps the color scheme alive, and best of all, they work. Again, so if you're at all interested, I'll be posting more flies of this nature. I have others I tie like this where you can use almost any pattern you like using beads to give you whatever body color you want. The beads are easy to get. I mean, your local fly tying shop has them. Your local craft shop has them. There are some specialty bead stores. If you're lucky enough to live near one, you can go in and pick them out there. You can get them online from bead stores. There are literally thousands of options. So if you're using green, what shade of green do you want? What size do you want? These beads I particularly like, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this, because if I turn it just the right angle, you may be able to see it. The center of the bead, the lining of the bead, is silvered, which really ups the reflectivity of the beads. There are some that have that, some that do not. Some with the color is like a solid color. So these I like because they're transparent. They give more of a sense of depth. But you can go with anything you like. These beads, as I mentioned, are between 3 and 4 millimeters. Now, buying beads, it's tricky because they sell them under several systems. Sometimes by diameter in millimeters, sometimes by an aught size. So these, I believe, are like an 8-aught. For smaller flies, I use like 11-aught. So it works like other systems that the higher the number, the smaller. And so an 8-aught technically would be an eighth, with 8 of them to an inch. But the bead sizes are, as you can see, even see here, are not, even in the same batch, are not fully consistent. Which you can use to your advantage because you can actually build a taper in if some are a little bigger and some are a little smaller. Anyway, again, from East Jersey Trout Unlimited, we have fly tying classes. In September of 2023, we will be starting up our next round. You can go to the East Jersey TU site. And, whoops, I have a loose, there we go, loose hair there. The East Jersey TU site, and you can get more information on those fly tying classes. Or on any other projects we have going on, because a lot of them are conservation projects. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free, or comments, please feel free to post them. I can always make these better, and your input can always help. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.